Okay, so you've scrolled through the endless Instagram feeds, you ignore the haters like Bourbon Moth, and you have watched every video by Cam at Blacktail Studio and Andy at Manor, and you have decided to dip your toes in the world of making a resin table. Well, I'm going to share with you a few hints and tips that I've picked up over the last few years that will hopefully make your first resin pour as simple and as easy as possible. Well, hello again and welcome back to my channel. Now, I kind of stumbled across the idea for this most recent video based on my recent project of a walnut and extremely bright blue resin table. Now, the blue itself is a colour match for the company logo, which hopefully will work out very nice. And it kind of occurred to me that over the last 3 years I've been doing resin tables now, and I've picked up loads of hints and tips along the way, and I thought it'd be good to actually share them with yourselves. Now, during these little short sequences, you will hear the word preparation a lot, which I think is key to any kind of resin pour. I don't really compare it to woodworking as such, it's more like baking, because if you get all the ingredients right and you get all the stress of the preparation done correctly, then the actual process itself should be relatively straightforward. So anyway, let's cut to the first one, which is actually preparing your workspace. Okay, if you're in a nice sized workshop or a single garage or whatever environment you're doing your resin pouring, you've got to remember that dust and debris are the enemy of resin work, particularly if your colour tint is clear so you can actually see through the resin itself. So what you must do before you start doing anything else is get your shop vac out and start dusting around. If you've got an air scrubber, get that switched on and give yourself plenty of time to prep the surrounding area ready for your resin pour. The next tip I want to talk about is the actual preparation of the resin itself. Now, I use glass cast in its various guises for my projects, but this is applicable to other brands of resin as well. Now, what I like to do is take the containers, the resin and the hardener, and place them in a bucket of hot water and then allow it to cool before starting the mixing process. Now, I do this for a few reasons. Firstly, it changes the viscosity of the actual resin, so instead of it being a big, thick, gloopy consistency, it makes it into a more fine, runny consistency, which makes it easier to get your precise measurements right on the scales. Secondly, it helps eliminate air bubbles. So when you get to the pouring process and the mixing process, it does help to get rid of those air bubbles, so it's less passes with the heat gun later on. And finally, if your container of resin has gone discoloured or it ends up with like some kind of iceberg consistency inside, if you repeat the hot water process in a bucket and keep changing the water so it's hot, it will actually return the resin to its original state. So it isn't wrecked, it isn't ruined, it's fine if you follow that process. Okay, let's go on to the next tip. I know what I'm saying here is complete common sense, but bear with me. The importance of having all the equipment you need for your resin mix and your resin pour ready on your workbench to hand, so you're not stressing about looking for something once you've started the resin mixing process, is very important. Now, I'm going to show you what I always have to hand when I start my resin mixes, just to take away those kind of stress levels. Well, if I start at the back, I always have some non-stick baking paper around, so if I'm actually put that to cover my worktops really, as because if you do get a little bit of resin spilling over, it doesn't stick to it. And then obviously you've got your resin here ready to mix. I've got the tinting pigments here with a little container to stir and mix them before you actually pour it into the resin itself. Some form of polypropylene container to mix your resin with, obviously size depending on how much of a resin mix it is. I always have the gloves around. I've got some pigments on my hand there, never mind, so I always wear the gloves when I'm mixing my resin. Also some kind of paddle to actually mix the resin with, so a small amount I just kind of hand mix it, or I've got a plasterer's paddle thing here with my combi drill driver. Also, what have we got? Oh yeah, I've got 2 sets of scales. It's always important to get a decent set of scales really, I think, because your measurements have got to be accurate. The smaller one tends to be for the tinting pigment mix, and the larger one for obviously your resin mix, sorry. Heat gun always comes in handy if you've got any air bubbles later on in the line. I use these kind of brush for actually brushing the resin up along the side of the slab, and also this kind of like spreader sometimes comes in handy. They come in for handy for another use, which I'll show you a little bit later on in the video. And I think that's pretty much it. Oh, decorator's caulk, sorry, I always have some of this to hand because if your mould develops a leak, this is the best stuff to actually plug that leak on the outside. The yellow plasticine stuff you get from Glasscast can be a little bit hit and miss as to whether that works. Don't bother using hot glue, that doesn't work. Trust me, I know. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much everything. This is certainly one of the most important tips if you want to reduce your stress levels on your first resin table and resin pours, and that is the importance of making a good mould. Now, I have a specific video on this, which I'll leave a link in the description, and it's obviously popping up somewhere in the corner. This makes life so much easier, okay? What I use here is 3mm polypropylene sheets, which I get from glasscastresin.com. It's not expensive, I think it's about £11 a sheet or something like that. It's completely reusable and nothing sticks to it. All right, I know people, particularly over the pond in the US, they use melamine because they don't seem to have ready access to polypropylene sheets. Fine to use melamine, and they have that release agent spray that you use. That release agent spray, particularly in the UK, is not cheap. All right, and then once you've sprayed it, obviously it's gone, it can't be used again. There are sometimes errors with melamine, and that can cause problems trying to release your resin project from them, but you don't have that stress with polypropylene sheets. Okay, if you follow my method where you hot glue on the outside, and if you use decorator's caulk on the joint on the inside and let that all set and go off, it will work perfectly fine. Also, this actual project here has got over 10 kilos of resin in it, and the walnut itself I think was about 14-15 kilos, and the walls hold solid. All right, it's only unless I think you're doing the huge massive resin tables like Cam and Andy do, which isn't going to be like the likes of what we're doing, where you need the thicker walls. But this stuff here, it doesn't move. Also, what you should do, another little tip here, is whatever your final dimensions are for your resin table, always make your mold a little bit bigger. All right, so you can slot it in. It does require the use of a little bit more resin, but you can cut it to size after that. Don't presume the edges on this to be your final edges, because it doesn't work really that way. You need to trim it and get it nice and square, and then you can start working on the resin and the wood. So the importance of a good mold, folks. Oh, and one final point with this is make sure the table that you're working on is flat. Resin is self-leveling, okay? So if you haven't got a flat surface, it will start pooling on one side, and you don't want that because you're using unnecessary waste down the line. Okay, getting there. Let's go on to our next tip. Right, the next tip is to actually talk about the mixing of the resin and the hardener itself. So you spend all your time meticulously measuring out and getting your ratios correct. The next step, and this is what I picked up from a friend of mine, a fellow one-armed woodworker, Matt, who's over in the US. Really appreciate this tip, Matt, because it's a cracker and you don't see it in other videos, is to mix the resin slowly, okay? Whether you're using the plasterer's paddle or you're just hand mixing it because it's not a big quantity, but mix it in slowly and steadily. You are not whisking egg whites, okay? What you don't want is micro bubbles in your resin, particularly if it's transparent. So by mixing it slowly, that reduces those micro bubbles within the resin, which makes it nice and clear later on down the line. So you might not have heard that tip before, but it is a cracker. Mix the resin slowly before pouring. Following on from your little mixing tip is the same when you come to the pour itself. Now, I've only recently been doing this and I've found it to have much better results, and that is to slowly pour the resin into the mould around your piece of your live slab, your piece of timber. Okay, I found by pouring it nice and steady with a slow, steady, consistent, all right, there's a lack of air bubbles again. So slow and steady around. If you pour it quickly, it's more likely for air to get in there and then bubbles to start popping up. Not that it's going to cause a major problem, but it's a hassle you could do without. So in your resin pour, slow and steady all around the slab, less bubbles, less stress. A really important tip for resin beginners here, and that is securing the slab in place. Now, this setup here might look like total overkill, but I can promise you it isn't. We've all been guilty of, well, this piece of wood's really heavy, the weight of it will rest itself and it won't need to be supported. And then you pour the resin and you think, where's all my resin going? And what it's actually doing is it's going underneath and lifting the slab up. And when you turn it over 5 days later, you've got 5 kilos of resin underneath that you're going to actually have to trim down on a planer or something. So what I do is, once I've got the actual slab in place where I want it to be, I'll take some pieces of polypropylene or something like these mixing things, place it down, place a piece of wood on top of that, okay, and then 2 long pieces of timber secured with clamps to my actual work frame, or in this case my workbench. Okay, it's not going anywhere then. So when you pour your resin in nice and slowly around it, your slab will stay fixed in place, and then again, less hassle, less stress, and you can leave it for the next 5 or 6 days. I think it's important for a resin tips beginner video to talk about the importance of prepping your slab before you've even got anywhere near your resin mix. And if you just look at this one, which is an offcut from here, you really do need to get rid of those bark edges really. Now you can do it a couple of ways. You can use a chisel, hammer and chisel. I just sometimes dig in with a chisel, or I've got like a palm belt sander which I use outside and I go to town with that. Now you're not after ultra smooth finishes on the actual sides itself. I just use an 80 grit disc on my belt sander there. It's just to get rid of all the loose chippings, any bit of dead wood on there. If you see any knots, make sure you have a little check in there that there's nothing loose, because you want the resin to form a good solid bond with the wood, and you don't want any loose chippings or anything on that, particularly again if it's kind of transparent and it look all a bit of a mess after all that hard work you've done. So make sure you do good prep on the slab, and it just makes again so much easier further down the line. The next tip, as resin makers, are a little bit divided as whether to do this or not, and that's to take a coat of resin around the side of the timber to form a seal before the actual main pour. Now it's something I've decided to start doing more of recently, and it has helped again with a lack of those little air bubbles on the actual joint between the resin and the wood itself. I did it on my biggest resin project, which was my English yew and copper resin top, and it worked really well, and I've done it on this one as well. So it's something I do. Okay, I'm aware it's something other folk don't, but I think it does actually help to form that seal, providing you don't let it go completely off. So it's still at the B stage. You can get a nail mark into it before you do your deep resin pour. I think personally, it's a good thing to do. In a beginner's resin video, I think it's important to talk about these two things, temperature and PPE. Okay, people get really stressed about temperature, constantly checking their thermometer going, it's 19.5 degrees and I need it to be 19. In my experience, what resin likes, all right, is ambient consistent temperature. What it doesn't like is going from warm and hot during the day to very cold at night. So if your resin project is in your garage and your garage isn't heated, or it leaks, or it's got wind blowing through it, it's not a good idea. I have done it. I've done it in my original single garage. It takes a long time to cure, and there's no guarantees on whether it will cure properly. Okay, so don't worry about the 22, 21, 20 degrees. If you can get it at a consistent temperature, somewhere in and around the 18 to 20 degrees, and it doesn't deviate too much, okay, it's obviously going to go a bit cooler in the night, but it doesn't go from 18 to 2, all right, then keep that and it should be fine. PPE is another one, because you know, do you have your windows open, which then runs the risks of bugs and everything coming inside? Probably, well, some people do, some people don't. I keep them closed in here, but you must use your PPE. Get your mask on, okay? It doesn't matter what it says on the thing, that it's free from this and it's free from that. Get your mask on, use your PPE, okay? That's really important, okay? Some people have really big ventilated spaces that we see on those dream workshops on YouTube. We don't have those dream workshops, okay? And what has taught me over the last few months with sort of ongoing health issues is you only get one set of lungs and you need to look after them. So get your mask on when you're pouring your resin. And I think I'm going to leave it there for this one because I don't want to completely overload you with ideas. I am going to do separate follow-up videos in the future about how I finish off my resin projects with the wood, and also how I do little touch-up things and fill in gaps further down the line. But I think that's probably more suited to a separate video. This is just really designed for those who are thinking of doing a resin wood table for the first time, and just to give you a few hints, few tips, few ideas to help you along your way on your journey. And I wish you the best of luck with all your making endeavors. Okay, as ever everyone, if you need to get in touch or if there's any questions you'd like me to do in a follow-up video to this, then obviously there's all the social media links in the description, or there's the comment section down below. And thanks very much for watching. Take care, look after yourselves, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.